Why does Australia need nuclear submarines? Are we just escalating a huge arms race with a big Red Sea country and risking World War III whilst wasting hundreds of billions of dollars? Well, essentially, the sea country is what we call a revisionist power who want to change the status quo, of which Australia is part of, and they don't really have much time to do it. The latest data from the US Navy predicts that the most likely time the sea country would declare war is the late 2020s and not the previously believed 2030s, and that's because the sea country is suffering from multiple existential calamities, worse than anyone previously predicted, all at the same time. Their demographics are in complete crisis. They have one of the fastest aging populations in the world thanks to the one-child policy, and it's already starting to collapse. They're very quickly running out of fighting age men. Furthermore, their economy is in utter shambles. The housing debt crisis, the collapse of their colonial Belt and Road plans, the provincial government have so little money now, they've slashed the pay of their bureaucrats by half, and factories are closing down right across the country. But at the same time, they are also currently funding one of the fastest naval expansions in all of history, which now stands at 350 ships compared to 293 of the US. Now, don't forget any of that, because now we have to talk about the sea country's geopolitical weakness. 80% of their global trade and 95% of their energy imports are conducted in the South China Sea, and in fact over 80% of their oil imports moves through the Malacca Strait between Malaysia and Indonesia alone. And because of the failure of their Belt and Road project, the sea country has very few allies in the area and is surrounded by a chain of US allies and friendly nations from South Korea to Japan to Taiwan, the Philippines and India. And also relevant is that Russia only can supply them with about 15% of their oil needs, and 65% of their food is imported as well. It's very obvious that the sea country can be starved, can be cut off from the rest of the world and the resources they need to survive by just blockading some very narrow sea lanes. Looking at their antagonism of the West and their build-up of military bases in the South China Sea, it's become very apparent that the sea country isn't happy with their position and stand in opposition to the status quo powers. So considering their geopolitical aim to break out of this containment and reform the Western Pacific to fit their needs and their soon-to-be existential demographic and economic situation, if they are to achieve their goals, which they really do want, they need to declare war as soon as possible in the late 2020s. The longer they wait, the weaker they become, whilst their enemies grow stronger. As I said in my Why Russia is Attacking Ukraine video from over a year ago, it was the same dynamic that contributed to that decision. Putin had an aim of Russia becoming a superpower once again, to reclaim the lost Soviet lands and cast himself as a new Peter the Great, and because of Russia's stagnant economy and collapsing demographics, 2022 was deemed as the last possible moment to do this. And we saw the same dynamic in World War I. France's population was about to be surpassed by Germany, and because they thought war to be inevitable, it was better to fight it now than in 5 years' time when Germany had an even bigger advantage. And meanwhile, Germany was looking at Russia and thinking, oh my, they're industrializing at an incredible rate. Within a decade they will surpass us and be an unrivaled European superpower. We better fight this war now before we're swamped by Russians. Okay, so now we know why we need the submarine so soon, but why submarines? Well, these are the perfect vessels for inferior naval powers to deny access to an area. They're no good at transporting an offensive amphibious landing force, but they are incredibly useful to deny the use of narrow shipping lanes like the aforementioned Malacca Strait to an enemy. This is how Germany almost starved out Britain during World War II, despite their underpowered navy. Now let's talk about why nuclear. Well, the old Collins-class diesel submarines were simply not designed to operate so far away from Australia in the South China Sea. They were designed during a time when Australia had no Western Pacific enemies to speak of. Times have, however, changed. With only about 50 to 70 days of endurance travelling up to the South China Sea, they might have only a week or two of fuel to patrol before being forced to travel back home. A nuclear submarine has no such limitations. Also, diesel submarines need to surface pretty much every day, and although it's not for very long, given the ever-improving Sea Country satellite observing these small choke points, the risk of detection is unacceptably high. And now you might say, what's the point? These handful of submarines will never stop the might of the Sea Country's navy, and you'd be right, but that's not the point. Australia under no scenario would fight this war alone, but given how spread out the American and European navies are, it could take weeks to months for them to be ready to counter the Sea Country, and thus Australian submarines need only delay the Sea Country until the rest of the world can join in. Being a delaying force is important and shouldn't be sniffed at. The only reason why the French weren't wiped out at the beginning of World War I was because of how much the plucky Belgian army and the BEF delayed the German northern flanking force. You might be like our former Prime Minister Keating and say that fighting this war isn't in Australia's national interest, but this seriously gives a false sense of moral equivalency between the US and the Sea Country. We owe our security and liberty to the US, and our liberal democratic ideals are also in alignment. Tell me, would you rather live in a world that's created by the US or the Sea Country? And even if a war isn't fought, the hundreds of billions spent wouldn't be for naught. These submarines are also helping deter a war from happening in the first place, especially true because of the huge publicity this AUKUS project has been given. It's showing the Sea Country that Australia is not to be trifled with. Thanks for listening.